Alina's father raised his champagne glass to toast her sister's success. Then he pulled a second page from his jacket pocket, and she knew, right then, that the evening was never meant for both of them. This is what that garden looked like before everything changed. It was a Saturday evening in late September. The kind of evening where the air still holds a little warmth, but there is something underneath it, something cool that tells you summer is already gone. Her mother, Sophia, had called it a family honor gala. She had said those exact words on the phone the week before. Sophia's voice was smooth, and certain the way it always was when she had already decided how something would go. She told Alina to wear something appropriate. She told her to arrive at 6. She told her it would be a night to remember. Alina had believed her. That was the thing that would stay with her longest, not the humiliation itself, but the fact that she had walked into it with her whole chest open. She had stood in front of her bathroom mirror that evening and told herself that maybe this time would be different. Maybe her parents had finally decided to see her, not as the daughter who stumbled, but as the one who got back up every single time. She had pressed her hands flat against the bathroom counter and breathed slowly and chosen to hope. She wore a simple gray dress, nothing showy, nothing that would pull attention she did not earn. She drove herself to the Mendoza estate alone, parked along the curved driveway behind a row of other cars she did not recognize, and walked through the iron side gate into the back garden. What she saw stopped her for just a moment. White orchids everywhere, dozens of them, arranged in tall glass vases along both sides of a stone path that led to a low wooden stage. Crystal champagne flutes catching the last of the evening light. Round tables draped in white linen, each one set with silver and candles that had not yet been lit. A catering staff moving quietly between the tables. 50 guests already seated or standing in small groups, the kind of people her father collected the way other men collected art. Business partners. Church elders. Old neighbors from the years when the Mendoza name meant something in every room it entered. Alina stood at the edge of all of it and felt the familiar weight settle across her shoulders. The weight of being in a place where everyone already knew your story, or thought they did. Then she saw Lucia. Her younger sister stood near the stage in ivory silk, her dark hair swept back, her posture straight and easy the way it always was in rooms like this. Lucia looked like she had been poured into the evening. She looked like the reason the orchids were there. A few guests were already gravitating toward her, laughing at something she said, and Lucia smiled with her whole face the way she always had since they were small girls. Alina found her assigned seat in the front row, 3 chairs from the center. She sat down, set her small clutch in her lap, and folded her hands over it. The evening began gently enough. Carlos Mendoza took the microphone at 7 o'clock precisely. He was a tall man, silver at his temples, dressed in a dark suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had a voice that filled a room without effort, warm and weighted at the same time, the kind of voice people trusted before they had any reason to. He smiled at the gathered guests and thanked them for coming, and said that tonight was about honoring what the Mendoza family had built. Then he turned to Lucia. He spoke about her MBA, completed with distinction. He spoke about her corporate promotion, youngest in her department. He spoke about her composure, her discipline, her grace. He used the word grace 3 times. The guests applauded after each point, and the applause was genuine, the kind that comes from people who are genuinely impressed. Alina clapped too. She meant it. Whatever was broken between her and her family had nothing to do with Lucia's real accomplishments, and she would not shrink those down just because she was hurting. Then Carlos pulled the second page. His voice did not change. That was what cut the deepest. He did not lower it or harden it or let even a flicker of discomfort cross his face. He simply turned the page and continued speaking, the same warm tone, the same measured rhythm, as if what he was about to do was just another item on an agenda. He said a family is only as strong as its most honest members. He said honesty sometimes means naming what others are afraid to name. He said the Mendoza family had always valued truth over comfort. Then he said Alina's name. He said it clearly. He said it looking directly at her, not with cruelty in his eyes, but with something she almost could not name, something flat and decided and done. He said Alina's boutique had failed. He said she had walked away from a promising engagement. He said she had demonstrated, over the course of several years, a pattern of choices that caused difficulty for everyone connected to her. He framed every sentence carefully, the way you frame a picture, so the ugliest part sits right at the center. 50 pairs of eyes moved from the stage to Alina. She did not look away. She kept her spine straight and her hands still, and her face as quiet as she could keep it. She had promised herself on the drive over that whatever happened, she would not give this room the satisfaction of watching her break. So she sat and she listened, and she let every word land on her like stones she had been trained since childhood to carry. Sophia sat in a decorated chair at the front edge of the stage, her expression arranged into something that resembled dignified sorrow. A mother bearing a necessary pain. She had worn deep navy, pearls at her throat, and she nodded very slightly at 2 or 3 of her husband's sentences the way people nod in church when the pastor says something they have been believing privately for years. Lucia stood behind Carlos with her eyes lowered. Carlos reached his final line. He held it a half-second longer than the others, the way speakers do when they want the room to carry something home. He said he and Sophia hoped that one day Alina would find her footing, the way her sister had, and bring honor back to her name. Nobody laughed. That almost made it worse. A few faces wore that particular expression Alina had seen her whole life, the soft, tilted look of people who believe they are being sympathetic, but are actually relieved the story is not about them. A neighbor near the back murmured something to his wife. A cousin who had driven 2 hours for this evening looked down at the table. Alina looked at Lucia. Lucia's eyes finally lifted. For 1 second, just one, they found Alina's across the garden. And in that second, Alina saw something she had not expected to see. Not satisfaction, not relief. Something that looked almost like apology. Something tight and urgent and carefully held back. Alina looked away. She had learned not to build anything on what she thought she saw in her sister's face. She had been wrong too many times. So she turned back to the stage and looked at her father, who was already moving into the next portion of his remarks. Slides now, projected on a screen behind him, charts and timelines laying out Alina's financial history like a case file. And she pressed her hands flat against her clutch and breathed slowly and stayed exactly where she was. Because she was alone in this garden. She had known it from the moment she walked through that gate. She had just needed a moment to stop pretending otherwise. What she did not know, what she could not have known sitting in that front row with 50 eyes on the back of her neck, and her father's voice painting her like a cautionary tale on a Saturday evening in September, was that she was not alone at all. She had been alone her whole life in this family. Tonight was the last night that would ever be true. Carlos was not finished. He had moved past the slides now and was speaking again without them, his voice filling the garden the way it always had, smooth and unhurried, carrying the particular confidence of a man who had never once been interrupted in his own home. He was talking about responsibility. He was talking about the kind of choices that reflect on a family's name for years. He was looking at Alina when he said it, not cruelly, just directly, the way you look at something you have already decided the fate of. Alina sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing. Around her, the guests had gone quieter than they were at the start of the evening. The easy social noise of champagne and small talk had drained out of the garden sometime around the second page. Now the air felt thick and careful. The way it feels in a room where everyone knows something wrong is happening, but no one has decided yet whether to say so. A few people near the back had stopped looking at the stage entirely. A business associate of her father's was studying his own hands. The church elder who had greeted Alina warmly at the gate 2 hours ago was now very focused on the candle at the center of his table. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. And then Lucia did. She did not ask for the microphone. She did not raise her hand or clear her throat or wait for a pause in her father's remarks. She simply stepped forward from where she had been standing behind Carlos, and she reached out and she took it. Her fingers closed around the handle, and she lifted it cleanly from her father's grip before he had processed what was happening. Carlos turned to look at her. His expression moved through 3 things in rapid sequence: surprise, then confusion, then a warning that did not quite make it to his mouth in time. Lucia's voice was steady when she spoke. not loud, not shaking. Just steady, the way a person sounds when they have been rehearsing something for a long time and have finally decided that today is the day. She said, "Father, you forgot the most important part of the story." The garden went completely still. Sophia straightened in her chair. Her pearls caught the candlelight as she moved, and for a moment she looked almost regal, almost untouchable, the way she had always managed to look even when things were beginning to go wrong around her. She said Lucia's name in a low voice, just the name. It was both a question and a command. Lucia did not look at her mother. She walked calmly to the side of the stage, where the gala's professional sound system had been set up. A clean black panel with inputs and a small monitor, hired for the evening along with the catering staff and the orchids, and all the other things the Mendoza family used to make occasions feel important. She reached into the small pocket of her ivory dress, and she pulled out her phone. Carlos said her name, one word sharp and low. She did not stop. She plugged the phone in. For 2 full seconds, nothing happened. The garden held its breath. Alina sat in the front row and watched her sister's back and felt something move through her chest that she could not name, something between dread and a feeling she had almost forgotten the shape of. Then the audio began. It came through every speaker in the garden at once, full and clear. The way professional sound systems carry things. No crackle, no distortion, just voices filling the night air as cleanly as if the people speaking were standing right there among the orchids, and the candles, and the 50 guests who had come to witness a family honor its best and bury its worst. The first voice was Carlos. His voice on the recording was different from the voice he used on stage. Looser, warmer in a way that was somehow colder. He was laughing slightly when he spoke, the comfortable laugh of a man talking privately about something he has already decided is handled. He said Alina's boutique had needed one more supplier contract to survive. He said he had made a call. He said he had made it in the other direction. Nobody in the garden moved. Sophia's voice came next. She sounded almost bored, the way people sound when they are discussing logistics rather than lives. She said the engagement had been easy. A few words placed carefully with the right person. She said he had believed everything she told him. Alina heard this and felt the ground shift beneath her chair. She sat very still. She had known her engagement ended because the man she loved had pulled away, had grown cold and distant over the course of 2 months, until one morning he sat across from her at a kitchen table and told her he did not think they were right for each other. She had spent a year after that quietly blaming herself, turning the relationship over in her hands like a broken object, trying to find the piece she had dropped. She had never once considered that someone had placed the crack there deliberately. Carlos's voice continued on the recording. He was explaining something about their grandmother's estate. He said the trust fund had a disqualification clause, something the grandmother herself had written in, a provision that removed any beneficiary who demonstrated sustained financial instability or poor judgment over a documented period. He said once Alina looked unstable enough, the clause would trigger automatically. He said the boutique failing was only part of it. He said the broken engagement helped. He said the pattern had to be consistent to be convincing. A sound came from somewhere near the back of the garden, a chair scraping against stone. Nobody turned to look. Then Lucia's voice came through the speakers. Younger sounding, uncertain in a way the Lucia standing at the sound system was not. She asked what would happen if Alina found out. Sophia answered without hesitation. She said Alina would not find out. She said Alina never did. She said Alina had always assumed she failed on her own. She said that was the most useful thing about her. Alina's hands were flat against her thighs now. She was not gripping anything. She was not holding herself together in any visible way. She was just sitting there letting the words go into her the way cold water goes into a wound, finding every part of her that had ever quietly wondered if she was the problem, every part that had apologized and adjusted and made herself smaller so the family around her could look larger. All of it manufactured. The boutique, the engagement, the slow public accumulation of a life that looked like failure. None of it had been accident. None of it had been her. It had been architecture. Carlos lunged for the sound system. He moved fast for a man his age, crossing the stage in 3 strides, his hand reaching for the panel, his face carrying an expression Alina had never seen on it before, something stripped of the warmth and the authority and the careful dignity he wore everywhere he went. What was underneath was not grief, and it was not anger. It was fear. Lucia stepped in front of the panel. She did not push him. She did not raise her voice. She just placed herself between her father and the phone, and she stood there and she looked at him and she did not move. Carlos stopped. Maybe it was the look on her face. Maybe it was the 50 people watching. Maybe it was the sound of his own voice still coming through the speakers behind her, still laying out the plan, still talking about his daughters like they were pieces on a board he had been moving for years. Whatever it was, he stopped. Sophia was on her feet. Her composure had developed a fracture along its edges, barely visible, the way fine china looks right before it goes. She said the recording was out of context. She said it with conviction, the kind of conviction that comes from having said things with conviction your entire life regardless of whether they were true. The recording ended. The garden was so quiet Alina could hear the candles. Then she stood up. Her legs were steady. She had not planned this. She had not prepared a speech or rehearsed a line or decided in advance what she would do when this moment came, because she had not known this moment was coming. She had driven to this garden tonight to endure something and survive it. That was all she had come prepared for. But she was standing now, and her legs were steady, and her chest was clear in a way it had not been clear in years. And she walked to the stage, and she stood beside her sister, and Lucia looked at her, and something passed between them, not words, something older than words, and Alina reached out and Lucia placed the microphone in her hand. Alina looked at her father. Carlos Mendoza stood 2 feet away from her with his silver temples and his expensive suit and his beautiful ruined evening, and she looked at him for a long moment, and she did not feel rage the way she had expected she might. She felt something quieter than rage, something that had been waiting inside her for a very long time to finally be said in a room where it could not be buried. She said it evenly. She said it the way you say something you have already made peace with. She said, "You did not just lose a daughter tonight." She let the garden hold that for one breath. Then she said, "You lost both." Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. The garden held those 7 words the way a room holds smoke after a fire, clinging to everything, settling into the fabric of the evening so completely that no amount of careful arrangement could ever get it out. Alina stood on the stage beside her sister with the microphone still in her hand, and she looked out at 50 people who had arrived 2 hours ago, expecting to witness a family celebrate its best. What they had witnessed, instead, was something none of them had a polished word for. Then the fractures began. The family attorney was the first. He was a heavy-set man named Gerald who had handled Mendoza business for 11 years and who had always greeted Alina at family functions with the particular warmth of someone who is paid to be pleasant to everyone. He did not look warm now. He stood up from his table near the center of the garden, straightened his jacket with both hands, and walked toward Carlos with something held between 2 fingers. Alina recognized it as a business card only when he held it out. He did not shake Carlos's hand. He simply said he would need to review several documents before their scheduled meeting the following Thursday, and then he turned and walked toward the gate without looking back. Carlos stared at the card in his hand. The church elder who had nodded along to the list of Alina's failures was now looking at the tablecloth in front of him as if it contained something deeply important that required all of his attention. When Sophia moved toward him a few minutes later, he stood, touched her briefly on the arm, said he hoped the family would find some peace, and left before she could respond. He did not say goodbye to Carlos. Near the garden wall, a man Alina recognized only as one of her father's newer business partners was already on his phone, speaking quietly with his back to the room. She could not hear what he was saying. She did not need to. The guests did not leave loudly. That was the thing that stayed with her. There was no drama in their departure, no confrontation, no speeches. They simply began to go, in ones and twos and small quiet groups, the way water drains from a place it no longer has reason to stay. They set their champagne flutes down gently on the white linen tables. They gathered their jackets and their clutches. Some of them glanced at Alina as they passed, and their faces carried expressions she recognized. Not sympathy exactly, something more complicated, the look of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew about a family they had trusted. A few of them were recording on their phones. Alina saw the small screens glowing in the low evening light as they moved toward the exit. She said nothing about it. She understood that the recording Lucia had played through the speakers had not only filled this garden, it had already begun to travel. Carlos tried once more. He picked up the microphone that Alina had set back on its stand, and he turned to the remaining guests, and he began to speak. His voice was still practiced, still carrying the shape of authority it had always carried, but something underneath it had gone soft, the way a structure goes soft when the foundation beneath it has been removed. He said the family was going through a difficult period. He said recordings could be taken out of context. He said he hoped his friends would extend the same grace to the Mendoza family that they would want extended to their own. A woman near the second table, someone Alina vaguely remembered as a neighbor from years back, looked up at him and said very quietly, "Carlos, I think the evening is over." He stopped talking. Sophia came across the garden toward Lucia with her hands slightly raised, not reaching, just open, the gesture of a woman attempting to recover something she could feel slipping. Her composure had not fully broken, but it had thinned down to almost nothing, a single careful layer between the outside world and whatever was happening beneath it. She told Lucia that she had destroyed the family. She said it with a steadiness that cost her visibly. She said she hoped Lucia understood what she had done, that everything they had built, the name, the reputation, the relationships that had taken decades to cultivate, all of it was gone now because of one evening. Lucia looked at her mother for a long moment. She said, "You built it on her." Sophia's face did something then that Alina had never seen it do in her entire life. It cracked. Not into tears, not into anger, but into something rower and more honest than either, a sudden visibility of the real face beneath the performed one. And what Alina saw there was not the dignified sorrow her mother had arranged so carefully in the front row all evening. It was panic, plain and unadorned and unmistakable. Alina looked at it and felt nothing close to satisfaction. She felt something sadder than that, something that understood, in a way she had not been able to understand before tonight, that her mother was a woman who had chosen a version of life that required her children to be managed rather than loved, and that Sophia had made that choice so long ago and so completely that she no longer knew how to want anything different. That understanding did not fix anything. It did not give Alina back the boutique or the engagement or the 3 years she had spent quietly dismantling her own confidence, looking for the failures her parents had planted inside her like seeds. But it settled something, some final question she had been carrying. She turned away from her mother's face. She walked to where Lucia was standing, and she did not say anything, and Lucia did not say anything either. Lucia simply fell into step beside her, and they walked together through the garden, past the tall glass vases of white orchids that had not moved all evening, past the 5-tier cake on the long table near the far wall with its celebration piped in careful icing across the top, past the folding chairs, and the silver, and the candles that had burned down an inch since the evening began. They walked slowly, not because they were hesitating, because there was nothing left in this place that required hurrying toward or away from. They had already done the only thing that needed doing. Everything else was just the garden. Alina pushed open the iron gate, and they stepped through it together, and she heard it close behind them with a soft metallic sound that felt, in her body, like something final. Her car was parked along the curved driveway where she had left it. She unlocked it and got in, and Lucia opened the passenger door without being asked and sat down and pulled it shut. For a moment, they just sat there in the quiet of the car, while the sounds of the garden came faintly through the glass, low voices, the scrape of chairs, the particular silence of a party that has become something else entirely. Alina looked in the rearview mirror. The iron gate was visible at the edge of the frame. Beyond it, the white lights of the garden still glowed, and small clusters of guests were still gathered in the spaces between the tables, and the white orchids were still standing in their tall glass vases, and the cake was still on the table with its blue icing, and all the careful decoration of the evening was still exactly where it had been placed. Nobody was laughing. She put the car in drive and she left. Carlos called Alina 6 times over the following week. She looked at her phone each time and watched his name on the screen until it stopped. She did not feel guilty about this. She felt very little about it at all, which surprised her, because she had always imagined that the moment she stopped answering her father's calls, it would feel like something dramatic and wrenching. It felt like putting down something heavy she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was not part of her body. Sophia sent a message through the family group thread. She said there had been a misunderstanding and that she hoped cooler heads would prevail. Nobody replied. Not Alina, not Lucia, not the cousins who had sat at the back tables and slipped out without saying goodbye. The estate lawyer, the one who had been seated near the garden wall and left without a word to anyone, filed a formal inquiry into the management of the grandmother's trust within 10 days of the gala. Alina did not know the details of what followed that filing. She was not involved in the legal process that began to move through the Mendoza family's finances with the quiet efficiency of something that had been a long time coming. She knew it was happening. She knew it from the silence around her father's name in certain circles, a silence that said more than noise would have. 2 of Carlos's key business partners withdrew from a joint venture that had been 6 months in the making. No explanation was given publicly. None was needed. The recordings that guests had made on their own phones at the gala moved through the particular channels that such things move through. And the Mendoza name, which had taken decades to build into something that opened doors and filled rooms with applause, began the slow process of becoming a name that people said carefully, if they said it at all. Alina did not watch this happen. She had already gone somewhere else. The apartment she and Lucia found together was small. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen with a window that looked out onto a side street, a living room that held a second-hand sofa and a lamp, and not much else. It was in a part of the city that was nothing like the Mendoza estate. No iron gates, no curved driveway, no orchids arranged by someone paid to make things look like they meant something. It was just a place where 2 people could be quiet. On the first morning, Alina made coffee in the small kitchen and stood at the window while it brewed and watched the side street below. A man walking a dog, a car pulling slowly out of a space, a woman on her phone walking fast with her coat pulled around her. Ordinary things. Things that had nothing to do with honor or appearances or the curated performance of a family that had confused managing its children with loving them. Lucia came into the kitchen barefoot and poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter, and they stood there together in the morning light without speaking for a while, the way people do when they are finally in a place where silence does not mean danger. Alina thought about the 3 years she had spent believing she was the problem. She thought about the boutique she had built from nothing, the suppliers she had found, the long evenings of inventory and invoices, and the particular exhausted satisfaction of a thing you made with your own hands. She thought about the morning her father had made one call and ended it without ever being in the same room as it. She thought about the man she had loved who had grown cold and distant because her mother had placed carefully chosen words in the right ear at the right moment. And she thought about the year she had spent after that, turning herself over and over looking for the things she had done wrong. She had not done anything wrong. That was still settling into her. It would take time. She understood that. The story you tell yourself about why your life went the way it did does not change overnight just because you learned the truth in a garden. It changes slowly, in kitchens, in morning light, in the ordinary accumulation of days where nobody is keeping a list. She looked at her sister. Lucia was looking out the window too, her hands wrapped around her cup, her face quiet and a little tired in the way faces are when they have finally put something down. Alina thought about what Lucia had given up. Not just the one evening, not just the family position and the parents' approval, and the title of the daughter who had never disappointed anyone. Lucia had given up the version of herself that the Mendoza family had spent years constructing, the golden child, the contrast, the proof that their parenting had worked on at least one of their daughters. That identity had been built carefully and maintained at Alina's expense, and it had been real enough that Lucia could have kept it indefinitely. She could have stood behind Carlos on that stage and kept her eyes lowered and let the evening happen and walked back into her life on Monday with everything intact. She had chosen differently. Alina did not know exactly when Lucia had found the recordings or how long she had carried them before that Saturday evening. They had talked about some of it in the days after, in quiet pieces, the way you talk about something large when you are still figuring out the shape of it. Lucia had said she had found the files 3 months earlier, going through their father's study for something unrelated. She had said she had spent those 3 months deciding what to do with what she knew. She had said the gala, once she found out about it, had made the decision for her. Alina had listened and nodded, and had not asked the question she sometimes thought about late at night, which was whether Lucia had always known, or suspected, earlier than that. She did not ask because she understood that the answer would not change what Lucia had done in that garden, and what Lucia had done in that garden was the only thing that mattered now. Some people, Alina knew, would call what Lucia had done a betrayal of the family. Those were people who believed family was something you defended regardless of what it had done. Alina had believed that once too. She had believed it while she was absorbing blow after carefully constructed blow, blaming herself, apologizing, making herself smaller, because that was what you did for family. You protected the story even when the story was hurting you. She did not believe it anymore. She sipped her coffee and looked out at the side street and listened to the small, ordinary sounds of the apartment around her. The refrigerator hum, a door closing somewhere above them, the distant sound of the city going about its morning, and she felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of. She felt still. Not happy, not yet, not in the full unguarded way she hoped was somewhere ahead of her, but still. Like a person who has been running for a very long time and has finally reached a place where it is safe to stop. She had fewer things now than she had a week ago. Fewer people. Fewer certainties about the story of her own life. But the things she had left were honest, and the person standing beside her in the kitchen was real, and the silence between them was the kind that did not need to be filled with performance or management or the careful maintenance of a version of herself built to serve someone else's agenda. That was enough to begin with. Some inheritances are not written in documents or held in trust by lawyers or distributed according to clauses that can be triggered by the careful manufacture of another person's ruin. Some inheritances are smaller and quieter and worth more than anything a grandmother's estate could hold. Alina set her cup down on the kitchen counter. She had been given one. It was standing right next to her, barefoot, holding a coffee cup, watching the morning come in through a window in a small apartment that belonged to no one but them. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you that the people who share your blood are not always the ones who carry your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe. These stories exist because of the people who choose to stay with them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And if no one has told you today that you were not the problem, let this be the place where someone finally does.